On my 69th birthday, my son sent me a text. It contained just 2 sentences, and his wife even liked the message. That single text ended up costing them their access to a $30 million family fortune. What happened next is a story about what happens when you mistake a father's kindness for a fool's weakness. If you believe that families should be built on respect, not entitlement, then please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from, because I want to know how far this story travels. It all began on the quietest birthday of my life. The silence was the first thing you'd notice. In a house like mine, a sprawling custom-built home in the Green Hills of Connecticut, silence is an achievement. It's a testament to thick walls, insulated windows, and a life carefully curated to keep the noise of the world at bay. But on this particular evening, the silence wasn't peaceful. It was heavy. It was the sound of absence. I sat in my leather armchair, the one my late wife Anna always said made me look too serious, and stared at the grandfather clock in the hall. Its steady rhythmic tick was the only thing marking the passage of time. 68 years had come and gone. Now the 69th was slipping away 1 second at a time, unnoticed by the two people who mattered most. My phone lay dark on the polished oak table beside me. I'd picked it up a dozen times, my thumb hovering over the contacts, only to set it down again. They're busy, I told myself. Leo has that new project, and Chloe is probably planning another one of her charity galas. It was an excuse, and a poor one at that. A son doesn't forget his father's birthday. Not unless he is taught to. Or perhaps not unless he has been given so much that there's nothing left to be grateful for. The house was filled with ghosts of a happier time. I could almost hear Leo's childhood laughter echoing from the staircase, or see Anna arranging flowers on the mantelpiece, her smile brightening the entire room. After she was gone, I had poured everything I had left into our son. I saw it as my duty, my final promise to her. I had provided. I had enabled. I had given him a life free of the hardships I had faced building my architectural hardware empire from a dusty workshop into a national brand. I had given him everything I realized with a slow, sinking feeling, except for a reason to respect the man who had provided it. Finally, the ache of loneliness became too much to bear. I wasn't looking for a gift or a party. I just wanted a connection, a simple acknowledgement that I still existed in their world. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the last decade, I picked up the phone. My fingers felt clumsy as I typed out the message. I read it over and over, deleting words, trying to make it sound casual, anything but desperate. In the end, I settled on something simple, something a father says to his son. Just wanted to say I love you both. Hope you're having a good week. I hit send before I could second-guess myself again. For a moment, I felt a flicker of relief. The message was sent. The silence was broken. Now I just had to wait. I didn't have to wait long. Less than a minute later, my phone buzzed on the table. A surge of warmth and hope shot through me. He replied. He remembered. Maybe they were just busy. Maybe I was just an old man getting sentimental and overthinking everything. I smiled to myself as I reached for the phone, my heart feeling lighter than it had all day. Then I read the message. The screen glowed in the dim light of the living room, illuminating 2 sentences that felt colder than the October air outside. We need space from you. Please don't reach out anymore at all. I read the words once, then twice. I felt the air leave my lungs as if I'd been punched in the chest. It wasn't the anger or petulance of a young man having a bad day. It was a dismissal. It was a corporate, sterile, HR-approved termination of a relationship. It was an execution. My son had just fired his father. My mind went numb. I couldn't process the cruelty of it. Space for 20 years after his mother died, my life had revolved around giving him a foundation to build his own. But I had made a terrible mistake. I hadn't given him a foundation. I had given him a fully furnished penthouse, and he was now complaining about the landlord. As the initial shock began to subside, my eyes focused on a small detail below the text bubble. a detail that took the cold cruelty of the message and dipped it in poison. It was a small red heart icon, and next to it 2 words, "Chloe liked this message." That was the moment everything broke. The heartbreak I felt wasn't a loud shattering sound. It was a quiet, deep fracture, the kind that splinters a solid foundation until the whole structure is compromised. Chloe, his wife. The woman whose lavish wedding I had paid for without blinking, the one who drove a Range Rover I had bought her as a birthday present. Her liking that message wasn't just agreement. It was applause. It was a digital high five for her husband's cruelty. In that moment, I saw their partnership with blinding clarity. They weren't just a couple. They were a team united in their entitlement. The memories, the ones I had pushed aside for years to keep the peace, came flooding back. They weren't individual events anymore. They were connected dots forming a perfect, ugly picture. The $500,000 down payment for their penthouse in Tribeca, an apartment they referred to as a starter home. The constant stream of credit card statements that arrived at my address, filled with charges from designer boutiques and 5-star resorts, all quietly paid from my accounts. I remembered the phone call just 6 months ago. Leo's voice, breezy and casual, asking for $200,000 to fund Chloe's latest business idea, an online gallery for emerging artists. He'd presented it not as a request, but as a notification of a withdrawal. When I had gently suggested he should perhaps use some of his own capital, he had laughed. "Dad, this is my capital. It's the family money." I had let it go. I had transferred the money. I had always transferred the money. Because I loved my son, and because I was a fool who believed that one day he would wake up and understand. I was wrong. The text message on my phone was the proof. To them, I wasn't a father. I wasn't even a person. I was a resource, a fund, an endless, faceless supply of money that was getting inconveniently sentimental in its old age. And now the resource was being told to stop making contact. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the manicured lawn stretching into the darkness. The garden Anna and I had planted together. The home I had built for my family. A profound coldness settled over me, extinguishing the last embers of my sadness. In its place was something new, something hard and clear and utterly calm. It wasn't anger, it was resolve. You cannot reason with entitlement. You cannot negotiate with disrespect. You can only cut off its supply. I walked back to the table and picked up my phone. My hands were perfectly steady. I opened Leo's contact information. I scrolled down to the bottom and pressed the button that said, "Block this caller." A confirmation message popped up. I pressed block contact without a flicker of hesitation. Then I did the same for Chloe. The digital silence was now complete, and it was on my terms. Then I made a second call. It rang twice before a familiar professional voice answered. "David Sterling." "David, it's Elias," I said, my voice even and calm. "Sorry to call so late." "Elias, no trouble at all. Everything all right?" There was a note of concern in his voice. David had been my lawyer and my friend for 30 years. He had drafted my will, set up my company, and most importantly, he had set up the Thorne Family Revocable Trust. "Everything is perfectly clear," I replied. "We need to meet, first thing tomorrow morning. It's time to make some significant adjustments to the trust." The drive to David Sterling's office the next morning felt different. I wasn't driving through the familiar winding roads of my town. I was moving through a new landscape, one defined by the cold clarity of my decision. The autumn leaves, which yesterday might have seemed beautiful and melancholic, now looked like dead things waiting to be swept away. There was no sadness left in me. There was only a quiet, resolute purpose. Sterling and Associates occupied the top floor of a glass tower in Stamford that overlooked the Long Island Sound. It was a world of quiet power, smelling of expensive leather and old paper, a place where fortunes were protected and dynasties were managed through carefully worded documents. David was standing by his panoramic window when his assistant showed me in. He was a man tailored as sharply as his legal arguments, his silver hair perfectly in place, his suit a testament to understated wealth. He turned, and his eyes, which could dissect a contract with surgical precision, met mine. There was no pity in his gaze, only a deep, knowing understanding. He gestured to one of the leather chairs opposite his vast mahogany desk. "Elias," he said, his voice calm. "Coffee." I shook my head and sat down. "Thank you, David. I just need to get this done." He nodded slowly, taking his seat. He folded his hands on the pristine desk, a single thick file placed squarely in the center between us. He didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't offer condolences. He simply waited. He was a good friend and an even better lawyer. He knew this wasn't a social call. I explained the events of the previous night, not with the trembling voice of a heartbroken father, but with the detached precision of a client reporting a breach of contract. I told him about my 69th birthday, the silence, the simple text I sent, and the 2-sentence reply I received. I even told him about Chloe's digital seal of approval, the small heart that had felt like a stiletto blade. When I finished, the silence in the office returned, but this time it felt different. It was an assessing silence, a weighing of facts. David leaned back in his chair, his expression unchanged. "I've been waiting for this call for 5 years, Elias," he said, his voice even. "Ever since Leo's 30th birthday party. The one you hosted at the yacht club. Do you remember what he said during his toast? He thanked you for providing the seed capital for his life, as if he were a startup and you were just an early-stage investor. I knew then that he didn't see you as a father anymore. He saw you as a bank. And Chloe, she's not just a beneficiary of that bank, she's the chief financial officer." Hearing my own unspoken fears articulated so clearly by a rational man like David was a profound relief. It was a validation. It wasn't me being a bitter old man. This was a reality that had been visible to others for a long, long time. I had just been the last one to accept it. David slid the thick file across the desk. The gold lettering on the cover was stark, "The Thorne Family Revocable Trust. Everything of significance is in here." He began, his tone shifting from that of a friend to that of legal counsel. "The deed to their penthouse is held by the trust. The lease agreements for their vehicles are in the trust's name. Their credit lines are guaranteed by the trust's assets. And of course, the $30,000 monthly allowance is a direct disbursement from the trust." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "You see, Elias, when we set this up after Anna passed, we did it to protect your assets and to make things simple for Leo when you were gone. It's a revocable trust. Think of it as a steel safe. You, as the grantor, filled the safe with your assets. You, as the sole trustee, hold the only key. You can open it whenever you want, take things out, put new things in, or change the instructions about who gets the contents. Right now, the instructions name Leo and Chloe as the primary beneficiaries. But the power, the key, it has never left your hand. You have absolute unilateral control to change any and all provisions of this trust at any time for any reason." I looked at the document, at my own name printed on the cover. For years, I had seen that trust as a lifeline for my son, a way to ensure his comfort and security. Now I saw it for what it truly was, a tool, a mechanism of control that I had forgotten I possessed. I had been funding an insurgency against my own dignity with my own money. I met David's gaze. There was no doubt in my mind. The path forward was clear, and I would not waver. "Let's start the process," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "I want them removed, completely. Terminate the lease on the penthouse. Cancel every credit line. Stop the monthly disbursements effective immediately. Everything, David." I leaned forward slightly. "We're turning off the supply." While I was in David's office setting the board, the first pieces were already being knocked over miles away in Manhattan. The game had begun, and my son and his wife had no idea they were even playing. I can picture the scene perfectly, as if I were a fly on the wall, because it was a scene they had performed 100 times before. Only this time, the script had been changed without their knowledge. They were having lunch at Per Se, a restaurant, where the price of a single meal could feed a family for a month. It was their natural habitat, a world of hushed tones, panoramic views of Central Park, and food that was arranged more than it was cooked. Chloe was likely taking an artfully composed photo of her truffle-dusted risotto for her social media followers, while Leo swirled a $1,000 bottle of wine pontificating to the sommelier about its subtle notes of oak and blackberry. They were performing the role of wealthy, influential people, a role they had mastered, without ever having to read the source material of hard work or consequence. The meal concluded as it always did, with laughter and the quiet, respectful placement of a leather-bound bill folder on their table. Leo would have picked it up with that casual air of ownership. He had a gesture he'd learned from watching me, but without understanding the weight behind it. He wouldn't even have looked at the 4-figure total. Why would he? The money wasn't real to him. It was a concept, a river that flowed endlessly from a distant mountain he never had to climb. He would have handed the waiter his American Express black card, the one made of titanium, the one he called his heavy metal, and leaned back ready to discuss whether they should fly to Aspen or St. Bart's for the weekend. A few minutes would have passed, long enough for the conversation to resume, long enough for the performance to continue. Then the waiter would have returned to the table, his expression a perfect professional mask of apology. "I'm very sorry, Mr. Thorne," he would have said, his voice low, "but the card has been declined." Leo's first reaction would have been a short, incredulous laugh. "Declined? That's impossible. Run it again. Your machine must be acting up." It was a statement of fact, not a request. In his world, that card did not decline. The universe did not operate that way. Chloe would have looked annoyed, bothered by this small, vulgar tear in the fabric of their perfect afternoon. The waiter would have obliged, of course. He would have returned a minute later with the same result. "My apologies again, sir. It seems there is an issue with the card. Perhaps another form of payment." The annoyance on Leo's face would now be mixed with a flicker of genuine embarrassment. He was being challenged in his own arena. He would have pulled out a second card, a platinum visa, with a dismissive wave. "Here, this one has no limit." But it did have a limit. A new one set to 0. The waiter's third trip to the table would have been more somber. The professional smile was gone, replaced by a look of cautious concern. Chloe, sensing a real problem, would have stopped scrolling through her phone. "Leo, what is going on?" she'd hiss. She would then offer her own card, a sapphire reserve, with a look that dared the universe to decline it too. It was declined. The table, once a stage for their affluence, was now an island of quiet, escalating panic. The laughter was gone. Their voices were now urgent whispers. "What is happening?" Chloe would demand. "Did you miss a payment?" "Of course I didn't miss a payment." Leo would snap back, his confidence completely shattered. "My father's office handles all of it. It's all automated through the trust. It's impossible." That word again. Impossible. The word of a man who had never faced a closed door. He'd pull out his phone, a desperate attempt to restore order to his crumbling reality. "I'm calling Dad. There's been some kind of massive screw-up at the bank." He would tap the screen, bringing my contact photo up. He would press the call button and raise the phone to his ear, expecting to hear the familiar ring. But there would be no ring. Just the flat, immediate silence of a call that goes straight to voicemail. His brow would furrow in confusion. He would try again. Same result. The connection was instantly severed. A cold dread would begin to creep into his expression. This wasn't a technical error. This felt different. He'd switched to text messages, his thumbs flying across the screen. "Dad, what's going on with the cards?" "None of them are working. Call me." He would hit send, expecting the blue bubble to appear with the word "delivered" beneath it. Instead, a green bubble would pop up and underneath it, a small damning notification in red letters, "Message failed to send." He would stare at it, his mind refusing to connect the dots. Then he'd try again, and again, the red letters mocking him each time. And then the horrifying realization would dawn on him. This wasn't a network issue. This wasn't a banking error. This was a wall. A deliberate, impenetrable wall. He had been blocked. "He blocked me," he would whisper, his voice hollow with disbelief. "My own father blocked my number." Chloe's face would have turned pale beneath her expensive makeup. The problem was no longer about paying for lunch. It was existential. Why would he do that? "What did you do?" she would ask, her voice sharp with accusation. "I didn't do anything." He'd insist, his mind racing, trying to find a reason, an explanation for why the world had suddenly turned upside down. We told him we needed some space." The absurdity of the situation would have hit them then. Stranded in one of the most expensive restaurants in New York, unable to pay. "How are we going to pay for this?" Chloe would whisper frantically, looking around to see if anyone was watching their little drama unfold. "The mortgage payment is due on the 1st, Leo, and the lease on my Range Rover. What are we going to do?" A desperate hope would flicker in Leo's eyes. "The allowance," he'd say. "The 30,000. It was due yesterday. It has to be in the checking account. It's automatic." "Then check it," Chloe would command. "Check it now." With trembling hands, Leo would have opened his banking app, his face illuminated by the pale blue light of the screen. He would stare at the balance, his expression slowly turning from panic to utter despair. He'd look up at his wife, his face ashen. "It's not there," he'd say, the words barely audible. "The transfer never came." In the days that followed my meeting with David, my silence became my primary weapon. It was not a passive absence of sound. It was an active, strategic presence. While my son and his wife were screaming into a void, my life became more peaceful than it had been in years. I tended to my garden. I spent afternoons in my woodshop, the scent of fresh-cut cedar filling the air. I read the books I'd been meaning to get to for years. I did not check my phone obsessively. I did not wait for an apology. I had made my move on the chessboard, and now I simply let the consequences ripple outwards, knowing they would find their targets with perfect accuracy. The first ripple hit their home life. I could picture Chloe dressed in her $200 yoga pants, waiting for the weekly cleaning service to arrive. She would have grown impatient, tapping her foot on the polished hardwood floors she had never once cleaned herself. Eventually, a text would have arrived from the agency, a message of polite corporate finality. "Dear Ms. Thorne, we are writing to inform you that your service agreement has been suspended due to non-payment." The dust bunnies would begin their slow, quiet conquest of the penthouse. The next ripple would have found Leo. He would have arrived at his exclusive gym, a place where trainers cost more per hour than most people make in a day. He'd be ready for his session only to have his key fob denied at the entrance. The receptionist, with a practiced sympathetic wince, would have informed him that his membership had been frozen. For a man like Leo, whose identity was built on a foundation of effortless access, a closed door is not just an inconvenience, it's an insult to his very being. Then the smaller daily comforts would have vanished. The curated boxes of organic pre-portioned meals would stop appearing at their doorstep. They would be forced to navigate a grocery store, a place they probably viewed with the same anthropological curiosity as a museum. The automatic payments for their wine club subscription, their streaming services, their dog walker, one by one, the invisible pillars holding up their effortless life, began to crumble. The world they knew was being unplugged, circuit by circuit, and that is when the next phase began, the liquidation. Pride is a luxury item, and theirs was the first thing they had to sell. I can imagine the tense, bitter conversations in their once perfect apartment. Chloe, her eyes filled with a rage born of fear, pulling out the designer handbags I had bought her. Each one a symbol of a life that was evaporating, before her eyes. Leo, his hands trembling slightly, taking off the Swiss watch I had given him for his 30th birthday. They wouldn't go to a common pawn shop. Their pride wouldn't allow it. They would have visited high-end consignment boutiques on Madison Avenue, pretending they were simply curating their collection, all while desperately hoping the check would be large enough to cover next week's expenses. The very gifts I had given them out of love were now being converted into survival cash. The irony was as sharp as it was painful. Their arrogance, once a fortress, was now just rubble. In its place, a raw, primal fear began to grow. The world, for the first time in their lives, was not bending to their will. The safety net they had taken for granted, the one they never even acknowledged, was gone. They were in a free fall, and the ground was rushing up to meet them. Fear is a powerful teacher. It's the one lesson I realized I had failed to give my son, and now the world was teaching it to him for me. Their attempts to reach me became more frantic. My phone, which I kept on silent in my study, became a silent testament to their desperation. Unfamiliar numbers would flash on the screen. I'd let them go to voicemail. An hour later, I would listen. It was always Leo, his voice tight with a forced artificial calm. "Dad. It's me. I'm calling from a friend's phone. Pick up. This isn't funny anymore. We need to talk." The word need was still there. He still believed he was in a position to make demands. More calls came. More texts from numbers I didn't recognize, each one more urgent than the last. They were a frantic storm beating against the stone walls of my silence. But inside those walls I was at peace. I didn't need to block these new numbers. My silence was the only block necessary. It was my answer to every question, my response to every demand, and my rebuttal to every accusation. It was a constant, unwavering, and deeply unsatisfying no. They had asked for space. I was simply giving it to them in a way they had never expected. A month passed. For me, it was a month of quiet routine and newfound peace. For them, it was a month of slow-motion drowning. David kept me informed of the key developments, not out of a sense of gossip, but as a matter of legal record. I knew the money they'd gotten from selling their trinkets wouldn't last. It was like using a teacup to bail out a sinking yacht. They were patching small holes while a gaping chasm was opening up beneath the waterline. And after 30 days of silence, I knew the real storm was about to hit. It arrived in the form of a single piece of paper. It would have been taped to the heavy imported wood of their penthouse door. An official notice from the building's management company, its stark black and red lettering, a violent contrast to the serene elegance of their hallway. It was a notice to vacate for non-payment of rent. I can imagine the moment Leo found it. The confusion, the immediate assumption that it was a mistake, a clerical error meant for someone else. Then the dawning horror as he read the details. Tenant name, the Thorne Family Trust. Amount overdue 2 months' rent totaling $60,000. Chloe's reaction would have been disbelief followed by pure rage. "Rent?" She would have shrieked, the word foreign and insulting on her tongue. "What do you mean rent? We own this place, your father bought it for us." And that would have been the moment of true, soul-crushing revelation for my son. He would have had to admit the truth, perhaps, for the first time, even to himself. I thought he did," he'd stammer. "He always just handled it." They were living in a gilded cage and had never once thought to ask who held the key. The foundation of their entire life, the very floor beneath their feet, wasn't solid ground. It was a rental agreement, and the lease had just expired. The security they had felt was an illusion, and it had just vanished. As if the universe had decided to choreograph their downfall with maximum efficiency, the second blow landed that very same afternoon. Reeling from the eviction notice, their world shrinking to the four walls, they had less than 30 days to vacate. Chloe must have decided she needed to escape. Maybe she was going to a friend's house to complain, or to her mother's to cry. She would have stormed out of the building, her face a mask of fury, and walked towards the spot where she always left her white Range Rover. But the car wasn't there. In its place was a tow truck, its yellow lights flashing with a kind of cheerful indifference. Her car, her status symbol, the vehicle she had so proudly featured in her social media posts was already hooked. Its front wheels lifted ignominiously off the pavement. A man in a jumpsuit with a clipboard would have met her protests with a shrug. He had the paperwork. The vehicle was being repossessed. Lessee the Thorne Family Trust. Account status. Delinquent. This wasn't a private failure. This was a public spectacle. The doorman who had for years rushed to open her door would have watched with a carefully neutral expression. Neighbors would have peered from their windows. It was the ultimate social humiliation, a real-time downgrade of her entire existence played out on the streets of Manhattan. She could scream, she could threaten, she could cry. It wouldn't matter. The man with the clipboard held all the power. The truck would have groaned, pulled away from the curb, and taken the last vestige of her curated life with it. That was the breaking point. The 1-2 punch of losing their home and their transportation in the span of a few hours shattered whatever composure they had left. Panic in the face of a declined credit card is one thing. The terror of impending homelessness is another entirely. A person's true character isn't revealed in comfort. It's forged in crisis. I had provided my son a lifetime of comfort. Now the crisis would finally reveal the man I had raised. Their options had dwindled to nothing. They had no allies to call, no hidden funds to access. There was only one car left, Leo's sedan. And there was one last desperate and foolish idea. The source of their problem was also in their minds the only possible solution. They had been trying to fight my silence from a distance. Now they would bring the war to my doorstep. I imagine the final conversation in that empty, echoing apartment was short and grim. All the blame and accusations had likely been exhausted, leaving only the raw, metallic taste of desperation. Leo, his face pale and his eyes burning with a new, dangerous energy, would have grabbed the last set of car keys off the marble countertop. He would have looked at Chloe, his partner, in a collapsing empire. "Get in the car," he'd say, his voice devoid of its usual arrogance, replaced now with the sharp edge of a man with nothing left to lose. "We're going to Connecticut. He can't ignore us if we're standing on his front lawn. He has to face us." The drive from Manhattan to my home in Connecticut takes about an hour without traffic. For them, I imagine it was an hour filled with a volatile mix of rage, fear, and a desperate flickering hope that a face-to-face confrontation could change things. They still operated under the delusion that their presence, their emotions, held some power over me. They were coming to my home to make a scene, believing that shame or guilt would be the key to opening the vault. They failed to understand that the man they were coming to see no longer lived there. I was in the rose garden when they arrived. My security system had given me a quiet, discreet notification on my watch a few minutes earlier: vehicle approaching. I didn't need to check the cameras. I knew who it was. The garden was my sanctuary, the place Anna and I had designed together decades ago. Each rose bush had a name, a history. Tending to them was a form of meditation, a slow, deliberate act of creation and maintenance. That day I had put on my noise-canceling headphones, selecting a playlist of Bach's cello suites. The rich, orderly music filled my head, a perfect soundtrack for the task at hand. The world outside, that music outside the 10-foot stone wall that surrounded my property, simply ceased to exist. I knew they were at the front gate. I could imagine the scene without seeing it. Leo's hand jabbing at the intercom button with increasing force. Chloe pacing on the gravel driveway, her expensive shoes ill-suited for a battle she was about to lose. They would have been met with the same thing that had tormented them for the past month: absolute, impenetrable silence. The intercom would not buzz. The gates would not open. From the edge of the garden, through a carefully trimmed hedge, I had a clear view of the road leading to the house. I watched as they abandoned the gate and began to walk the perimeter of the wall, looking for a weakness, a way in. They looked like castaways searching for a breach in the cliffs of an unbreachable island. Eventually, they reached a section where the ornamental iron fence gave them a view of the backyard. And that's when they saw me. I could feel their eyes on me. It was a tangible thing, a prickling on the back of my neck. I knew they were there, standing just 100 feet away, their faces likely pressed against the cold iron bars. I did not turn. I did not acknowledge them. I focused on the task at hand. I selected a hybrid tea rose, a deep crimson one named Mr. Lincoln. I inspected its leaves for any sign of black spot, my movements slow and methodical. I chose my pruning shears, the steel glinting in the afternoon sun, and made a clean, precise cut just above a 5-leaflet stem. This was the true confrontation. Not a shouting match, but a demonstration. My peace against their chaos. My silence against their noise. My closed garden against their collapsing world. They began to shout. I couldn't hear the words, of course. Through the masterful layers of Bach, their frantic cries were reduced to a faint, irrelevant buzzing, like distant insects. But I could see them. I could see Leo's face, red and contorted with rage. I could see Chloe's frantic gestures, her hands pleading one moment and balled into fists the next. They were putting on a grand performance of desperation, but the audience couldn't hear them. They were screaming into a soundproof room. Their power, the emotional leverage they had always held over me, was gone. Their words, which had once been able to cut me to the core, could no longer even reach my ears. They must have gone on like that for 10 minutes, their energy eventually giving way to a ragged, hopeless exhaustion. And that's when the security car arrived. My system is programmed to automatically alert the local patrol if the gate intercom is pressed more than 5 times in a minute, or if a vehicle lingers for more than 10. A sleek black sedan with the logo of the security firm on its side pulled up quietly behind their car. A uniformed officer, a man named Marcus, who had patrolled this neighborhood for years, got out. He was the embodiment of professional calm. He didn't rush or escalate the situation. He simply walked over to them, a polite but immovable presence. I couldn't hear the exchange, but I could read the body language. Leo's initial aggressive posture, Chloe's tearful, dramatic appeal, and Marcus's patient, unshakable stance. He would have listened, nodded, and then quietly informed them that they were on private property and had been asked to leave. They were no longer the son and daughter-in-law of the owner. They were trespassers. The defeat was absolute. There were no more cards to play. They slumped back to their one remaining car, all the fight gone out of them, and drove away. Marcus's car waited until they were out of sight before pulling away itself. The silence returned, this time deeper and more complete. Only then did I turn. I took off my headphones, and the sound of the real world rushed in the gentle breeze, the chirping of a finch in the oak tree. I walked over to the Mr. Lincoln rosebush. I snipped the perfect deep red bloom I had just pruned and held it, its fragrance rich and complex. I had weathered their final desperate assault without raising my voice, without taking a single step outside my garden. I had won not by fighting back, but by simply refusing to be part of their storm. The drive back to the city must have been a long and silent one. Their final desperate gambit had failed in the most humiliating way possible. They had brought all their fury and desperation to my door and had been turned away not by an angry confrontation, but by a wall of serene indifference. They had been dismissed. Their power was gone, their resources were gone, and now their hope was gone. What followed was the inevitable final stage of their collapse, the complete unraveling. It began that evening. It was a storm of communication directed at a man who was sitting peacefully in his study reading a book on Roman history. The calls came from numbers I didn't recognize, one after the other, a frantic digital assault. I had set my phone to automatically silence and log any calls not from my contact list. I didn't have to lift a finger. The technology did the work, acting as a silent digital butler, turning away unwanted guests at the door. It wasn't until the next morning, as I drank my coffee and watched the sunrise paint the sky, that I decided to review the events of the night. Not out of concern, but out of a need for documentation. I opened my voicemail and I listened. The first message had come shortly after they would have gotten back to the city. Leo's voice was raw, ragged with fury. "You think this is a game? You think you can just hide behind your walls and your security guards? You can't do this to us. This is our life you're destroying. My wife is a wreck. We're losing everything. Do you even care after everything After everything you were supposed to do for us, the entitlement was still there, buried under the anger. The belief that I owed him this life of luxury." An hour later, another message from a different number. The tone had shifted. The anger was gone, replaced by a syrupy, cloying layer of fake concern. It was a performance, and a bad one at that. "Dad, it's me. Leo, we're worried about you. Seriously, not answering your phone, hiding away in your garden. It's not like you. We're worried about your health. Are you okay? Are you lonely? Please just let us know you're safe. That's all we want." I shook my head slowly at the transparent manipulation. They weren't worried about my health. They were worried about the health of their bank account. The messages continued throughout the night, a descending spiral into utter desperation. The final one, left sometime around 3 in the morning, was almost unrecognizable. The voice was hoarse, broken. All the anger and pretense had been stripped away, leaving only the sound of a man completely defeated. "Dad, please," he whispered, and I could hear the sound of Chloe crying softly in the background. "Please, I'm sorry. Okay, I'm truly sorry. For the text, for everything. We were stupid. We made a mistake. A terrible, terrible mistake. We'll do anything to make it right. I'll get a job, a real one, I swear. We'll pay you back. Just, please don't do this. Don't throw us away. We're your family. Please, Dad. Just call me back." After listening to the last pathetic plea, I exited the voicemail and opened my phone's blocked call registry. My system keeps a log of all incoming activity. I scrolled through the entries from the previous night. Page after page of blocked calls from a handful of unknown numbers, all time-stamped between 7 p.m. and 4 a.m. At the top of the screen, the phone's software had tallied the total. The number was precise: 109. 109 desperate, futile attempts to breach the walls of my resolve. I set the phone down. The experiment was complete. The data was collected. It was time for the final phase. I picked up the phone again and made a single call. "David," what I said when he answered. "It's time. Send them the email." A few hours later, message would have appeared in their inbox, an electronic dove in the midst of their flood of despair. It would have come not from me, but from the formal, intimidating address of Sterling and Associates. The subject line would have been simple: "Meeting regarding the Thorne Family Trust." The message itself was brief, professional, and devoid of any emotion. "Dear Mr. Thorne and Ms. Thorne, on behalf of my client, Elias Thorne, I am writing to invite you to a meeting to discuss the future of the Thorne Family Trust. The meeting will be held at our offices this Friday at 10:00 a.m. sharp. Please confirm your attendance at your earliest convenience." I knew exactly how they would interpret that email. They would not see the cold legal formality. They would not recognize the language of a summons. They would see it as a white flag of surrender. They would believe that their campaign of desperation, their 109 calls, their pathetic apologies, had finally worked. They would think they had broken me. They would believe they were coming to my lawyer's office to negotiate the terms of their reinstatement. They had no idea they were simply coming to sign their own death warrant. The morning of the meeting, I arrived at David's office an hour early. We sat in his private study, the final notarized documents resting between us on his desk. There was no last-minute hesitation, no flicker of doubt. The preceding month had only solidified my resolve. David reviewed the sequence of events one last time, not as a friend questioning my choice, but as a lawyer ensuring the execution would be flawless. "Are you ready, Elias?" he asked. I looked out the window at the city below, a sprawling ecosystem of cause and effect, of actions and consequences. "I've been ready for a long time," I said. "Let's go to the conference room." The room was designed to intimidate. It was a long, narrow space dominated by a single colossal slab of mahogany, polished to a mirror shine. One wall was entirely glass, offering a dizzying panoramic view of the city. It was a room that made you feel small, a place where multi-million-dollar deals and bitter corporate divorces were finalized with the stroke of a pen. It was the perfect venue for what was about to happen. I took my seat at the head of the table with David to my right. The heavy leather-bound document lay directly in front of me. We waited. They arrived precisely at 10 o'clock. Their punctuality was a sign of their desperation. They were led in by David's assistant, and for a moment I saw them not as my son and his wife, but as two strangers walking into a trap. They looked diminished. The weeks of stress had stripped away their glossy veneer. Leo's suit, though expensive, seemed to hang off his frame, and his eyes were shadowed with sleepless nights. Chloe's makeup couldn't quite hide the anxiety that tightened the corners of her mouth. They were trying to project an image of contrite, responsible adults, but they just looked like frightened children who had been called to the principal's office. They sat down opposite me, the vast expanse of polished wood between us, feeling like a chasm. The air was thick with unspoken words, heavy with the weight of expectation. David, ever the professional, broke the silence. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice neutral. "We have provided water for you. Elias has asked for this meeting to discuss the future of the family trust." That was Leo's cue. He cleared his throat, sat up straighter, and began the performance he had clearly rehearsed. "Dad," he started, his voice straining for a tone of earnest sincerity. "First of all, Chloe and I just want to say how deeply sorry we are. The last month has been a nightmare. But it's given us a lot of time to think, and we realize things got out of hand. There was a complete misunderstanding, a breakdown in communication." He paused, looking for a reaction from me. I gave him none. I simply sat there, my hands resting on the table, my expression unreadable. My silence unnerved him, and he rushed to fill it, his words tumbling out faster now. "We've been under a tremendous amount of stress lately with work and, well, everything. And we acted poorly. That text message, it was inexcusable. It was sent in a moment of frustration, and we never ever meant for it to hurt you. We love you, Dad. You're our father, and that's the most important thing." Chloe, on cue, reached across the table as if to touch my hand, her eyes welling up with crocodile tears. "We love you so much, Elias," she whispered. I continued to listen, my gaze steady. His speech was a masterpiece of evasion. It was filled with we and us, with external pressures and mutual misunderstandings. There was no ownership, no real accountability. He wasn't apologizing for what he did. He was apologizing for how I had reacted. He was apologizing because he was desperate, because his entire world had been taken away and he wanted it back. He spoke for another 5 minutes, his monologue winding through a maze of flimsy excuses and hollow promises about how things would be different from now on. When he finally sputtered to a stop, the silence that fell upon the room was even heavier than before. He looked at me, his eyes pleading, searching for a sign of forgiveness, a crack in my resolve. He was waiting for a conversation, a negotiation. He was expecting me to list my grievances, to demand new terms, to engage in the familiar emotional dance we had done so many times before. I let the silence stretch, letting their discomfort build to an almost unbearable level. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, I placed both my hands on the leather-bound document in front of me. The sound of my palms on the smooth cover was the only noise in the room. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue with his points or dissect his insincere apology. There was nothing left to debate. I pushed the document forward. It slid across the mirror-like surface of the table, its weight making a soft, hissing sound as it traveled the distance between us. It came to a stop directly in front of Leo. He stared down at it as if it were a venomous snake. Then for the first time in the meeting, I spoke. My voice was calm, level, and completely devoid of the emotion he had been trying so hard to provoke. "Thank you for sharing that, Leo," I said. "I have listened. Now I would like you to look at this." I tapped a finger on the embossed gold lettering on the cover. "This is the amended and restated Thorne Family Revocable Trust. I believe it will answer all of your questions about the future." With trembling hands, Leo reached for the document, Chloe leaning in so close their heads were nearly touching. They opened the leather cover. I watched them as their eyes scanned the dense pages flitting past the complex legal jargon, the paragraphs of impenetrable lawyer speak. They weren't reading for comprehension. They were searching for the numbers, for the familiar clauses that had been the bedrock of their entire adult lives. Their fingers fumbled as they turned the pages, a frantic search for a reality that no longer existed. I decided to guide them. My voice cut through their panicked silence, calm and clear. "You can turn to page 12, I said. "Section 3. It's the section on primary beneficiaries. I believe you'll find it has been simplified." Leo's finger traced the lines of text, his breathing growing shallow. I gave him a moment to find it. Then I continued laying out the facts with the dispassionate precision of a surgeon announcing a terminal diagnosis. "As you can see," I explained, Clause 3.1, which previously named you Leo and you Chloe as the sole and primary beneficiaries of this trust, has been legally and irrevocably removed. Chloe let out a small choked sound. Leo just stared at the page as if willing the words to rearrange themselves. "Furthermore," I continued, my voice unwavering, "Clause 3.2, the provision which stipulated the terms of the monthly $30,000 allowance and the payment of all associated credit lines and leases, has been deleted in its entirety. There are no longer any financial provisions for either of you in this document." The silence in the room was absolute. The only sound was the faint hum of the city traffic far below. Finally, Chloe looked up, her face a mask of utter disbelief. The question she asked was the last gasp of her lifelong entitlement, the final dying twitch of a worldview that had just been rendered extinct. "So," she stammered, her voice a reedy whisper, "so where does the money go?" I allowed myself a slow, deliberate motion. I turned a page in my own copy of the document, the crisp sound of the paper echoing in the quiet room. "An excellent and practical question, Chloe," I said. "If you will both turn to page 15, you'll find the new Clause 4.1. It outlines the Trust's revised primary directive and sole beneficiary." They fumbled to the page. They saw the new title, the new name, but they didn't understand. So I told them. The entirety of the Trust's assets, an estimated $32 million, will now be transferred to establish a new perpetual endowment. It will be called the Thorne Next Generation Scholarship. Before they could even process the name, David Sterling spoke for the first time, his voice adding a layer of cold legal finality. "The scholarship," David clarified, reading from a summary sheet, "is a full-ride endowment in perpetuity. It will cover all tuition, room, and board for students from low-income backgrounds who have demonstrated exceptional merit and wish to pursue degrees in business administration and industrial design at Connecticut State University." David's words hung in the air, each one a hammer blow. I let the silence stretch for a beat, and then I delivered the final fatal twist. I looked directly at my son. The boy I had raised, the man he had become, the failure he had chosen. "That's the school you dropped out of, Leo," I said, my voice perfectly level. "After I paid for 2 full years, I thought it was about time someone actually graduated from there with a Thorne family investment. And that was it. The collapse was total." Chloe made a sound like a wounded animal. Leo's face already pale, drained of all remaining color. He looked not just beaten, but erased. It wasn't just that the money was gone. It was that his greatest personal failure, the opportunity he had squandered out of laziness and arrogance, had been taken from him and immortalized as a monument to someone else's success. The foundation of his new life would be built upon the rubble of his old one. It was a perfect, inescapable, and legally binding form of poetic justice. They hadn't just lost their future. They had lost their past. 6 months later, I stood at a podium in a university auditorium. The air didn't smell of expensive perfume and catered food, but of old books and fresh paint and limitless potential. I wasn't surrounded by the wealthy and the powerful, but by students and their families, their faces bright with a pride that money could never buy. I looked happier, healthier, and more at peace than I had in 20 years. This was the inaugural awards ceremony for the Thorne Next Generation Scholarship, and I was giving the keynote address. I spoke about my own life, about starting a business in a dusty garage with nothing but a set of tools and an idea. I spoke about the dignity of work, the value of a second chance, and the difference between a price tag and true worth. A legacy, I told them, is not what you leave for people. It's what you leave inside of them. As I looked out at the faces of the young, ambitious students who would now have the opportunity my own son had thrown away, I knew I had finally made a sound investment. At that same moment across the state, my son was learning the language of consequence, a language I had failed to teach him. In a short, silent scene, you could see his new life. The sprawling penthouse was gone, replaced by a small 2-bedroom apartment above a laundromat. The expensive suits were gone, replaced by the high-visibility vest of a logistics coordinator. I saw him on a loading dock, a clipboard in his hand, looking tired but focused, his shoulders squared with a responsibility he had never known. And Chloe, her social media empire, a distant memory, was now managing a boutique clothing store in a suburban mall. I saw her patiently folding sweaters, her expression strained but resilient. The false glamour of her old life replaced by the stark reality of an hourly wage. Their life was no longer beautiful or easy. It was difficult, it was a struggle, and for the very first time it was theirs. Their relationship, I imagined, was a tense and fragile thing, but it was being rebuilt on the solid, unforgiving ground of reality. As I finished my speech and the applause filled the auditorium, my final thoughts were a quiet voiceover, a letter to the past. I had spent 30 years of my life writing checks. I finally realized it was time to start building a legacy. The last and most important gift I ever gave my son wasn't money. It was the very thing he had so cruelly asked for. It was space, the space to fail, the space to learn, the space to finally, on his own terms, stand up. In losing their inheritance, I had given them a chance to earn their own lives. In the process, I had reclaimed my own peace. And perhaps I thought one day I might get my son back. Not as a dependent, but as an equal. A relationship built not on obligation, but on a foundation of mutual, hard-won respect. Later that evening, I was back home sitting in the garden as the sun set, casting long shadows across the lawn. The air was cool and quiet. My phone, which had been silent for 6 months, buzzed on the small table beside me. I picked it up. It was a text message from a number I did not recognize. The message contained a single word. One word and a question mark. Dad. I stared at the screen for a long moment. There was no desperation in the text, no demand. It was just a question, an opening, a first step across a vast canyon of silence. A small, enigmatic smile touched my lips. It wasn't a smile of triumph or forgiveness, but a smile of quiet satisfaction. The power to answer, the power to decide the future was now entirely mine. I placed the phone screen down on the table. I didn't need to answer right away. I leaned back in my chair and listened to the sounds of the evening. The silence was no longer heavy with absence. It was light and filled with possibility. For the first time in a very long time, the silence felt like a beginning. This story is a powerful lesson, that true love must be balanced with firm boundaries. Elias Thorne's generosity meant to provide for his son, instead, created a deep-rooted entitlement that eroded respect and family connection. He discovered that endlessly providing for his children was not preparing them for life. It was disabling them. The most profound act of fatherhood was not writing another check, but finally saying no. By doing so, he gave his son the most difficult but valuable gift of all, the opportunity to face consequences, discover his own strength, and build a life of his own. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Do you believe setting hard boundaries is sometimes the greatest act of love?